When my father and I arrived at our new building, everything still seemed like a blur to me. I was sitting in the passenger seat, watching the city pass by while trying to come to terms with my mother's death. Moving to an old building seemed like just another challenge amid so many difficult events. Our new home was an imposing structure, but clearly worn by time. The entrance hall had marble floors and a wrought iron elevator that looked like something out of an old movie. We went up to our apartment on the 3rd floor, carrying boxes and furniture, trying to get used to the idea of calling that place home. On the 2nd day, while we were unpacking the last boxes, I heard a knock on the door. I answered and found an elderly man with grey hair and tired but kind eyes. "Hello, I'm Mr. Thompson, your neighbour from 304. He introduced himself with a slight smile. I called my father, who came to greet the new neighbour. Mr. Thompson explained that he was a retired veterinarian and had lived alone for many years. He seemed reclusive but not hostile, and invited us to have tea in his apartment someday. As the days passed, we began to adapt to the new environment. The building had a peculiar architecture, with long corridors and old, heavy wooden doors. Every day we discovered something new about the place and its inhabitants. Mr. Thompson was a constant presence, always offering help or sharing stories from his life. I noticed that despite his fragile appearance, he had a strong spirit and a vast life experience. He spoke fondly of his days as a veterinarian, treating animals of all species and sizes. Although the adjustment was gradual, I still felt an immense void from the loss of my mother. Mr. Thompson, in a way, helped fill part of that void with his conversations and advice. As we got used to the apartment and the building's routine, we began to feel more at home. Life went on, and we were determined to find a new beginning in that place. Exploring the old building was like entering a new world full of mysteries. Each corridor had its own story, and each door hid lives I could hardly imagine. On the 3rd day after our arrival, I decided it was time to meet some of our neighbours. Maybe this would help bring a little more life to the place we now called home. Our floor had 4 apartments, including ours. Mr. Thompson, the reclusive former veterinarian, lived in apartment 304. Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly lady with well-groomed white hair and a warm smile, lived in 303. She invited me in and, over cups of tea and homemade cookies, told me she had lived there for over 40 years and had seen many tenants come and go. "This building has its peculiarities, dear, but you will get used to it," she said, offering me another cookie. Apartment 301 was empty and available for rent. I knocked on a few more doors in the building, but most of the neighbours were out or didn't answer. I was a little disappointed, but knew there was still time to get to know them. As I went down to the ground floor, I met a boy my age in the entrance hall. He was sitting in a corner, focused on his laptop. He introduced himself as Alex, an aspiring programmer who was always looking for a quiet place to work. We chatted a bit, and he told me about some of the building's more eccentric tenants, including a woman who insisted the building was haunted by ancient spirits. In the early days, we adapted well to our new environment. However, the tranquility was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Miller. He moved into apartment 301 and brought with him a disturbing energy. He was a burly, middle-aged man with a cold, calculating look. On the day he arrived, he greeted us with a forced smile, but there was something in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. Soon after his arrival, the problems began. Mr. Miller seemed to take pleasure in causing discord. He knocked on our door at inconvenient hours, complaining about noise even when we were completely silent. The first time this happened, my father politely opened the door, but Mr. Miller's irritated expression did not change. "You need to keep it down in there. This building has rules," he said, without hiding his disdain. A few days later, as I was coming home from school, I found Mr. Miller waiting in the corridor. He blocked my way and started asking intrusive questions about my life and my father's. His presence was suffocating, and I couldn't wait to get away from him. "You and your father better not do anything wrong here. I'm watching you," he threatened before finally letting me pass. At night, I told my father about the incident. He tried to reassure me, saying we would deal with it, but I saw the concern in his eyes. Mr. Miller's behavior continued to worsen. He started complaining to other neighbors, spreading rumors about us. One day, while I was in the building's library, I heard Mr. Miller arguing with Mrs. Alvarez. He accused our apartment of having a strange smell, suggesting we were hiding something illegal. Mrs. Alvarez, kind as always, tried to calm him down, but he was determined to incriminate us. The following days were even more tense. Every time I or my father crossed paths with Mr. Miller, he gave us looks of distrust and disdain. The building, which initially Mr. Miller's presence was seriously starting to bother us. The man seemed to have a special talent for creating problems and making us uncomfortable, and things only got worse. One afternoon, while I was doing my homework in the living room, I heard loud, insistent knocks on the door. My father, who was in the kitchen, went to answer. From the tone of the voice, I knew immediately who it was. "Mr. Miller, what's going on?" my father asked, trying to stay calm. "I know what's going on here," Mr. Miller replied, his tone loaded with accusation. "I heard strange noises coming from your apartment. You have an animal in there, don't you?" My father frowned, clearly confused. "We don't have any animals, Mr. Miller. What you heard must have been a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" He laughed, but there was no humor in his voice. "I'm sure of what I heard, and I will prove it. You are breaking the building's rules." I got up and went to the door, standing next to my father. Mr. Miller gave me a piercing look, as if I were an accomplice in some terrible crime. "Please, Mr. Miller, we don't have any animals here," I said, trying to keep my voice firm, but he didn't seem convinced. He tried to force his way into the apartment, pushing the door with his shoulder. My father reacted quickly, blocking the entrance with his body and pushing the door back. "What do you think you're doing? You can't just barge into our apartment!" my father exclaimed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I have every right to check if you're following the rules," Mr. Miller shouted, forcing the door again. "If you continue this, I will call the police," my father threatened, his voice firm. This seemed to calm Mr. Miller down a bit. He backed off, but not without throwing a few more veiled threats. "This isn't over. You'll find out what you're hiding," he said, before turning and walking down the hallway. We closed the door, and I could see the tension on my father's face. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "We can't let this man intimidate us, Laura. We'll handle this." But even as he said this, I could see the worry in his eyes. Mr. Miller wasn't just an annoying neighbor. He was someone who seemed determined to cause us trouble. Mr. Miller's actions were becoming unbearable. Each day brought a new accusation or attempt at intimidation. My father and I decided it was time to take measures to protect ourselves. "We need proof, Dad," I said after yet another heated argument with Mr. Miller in the hallway. "If he keeps this up, we need something concrete to show the building management or the police." My father agreed. We decided to install a security camera in the hallway, pointed at our apartment door. We spent the afternoon setting up the device and checking the angles, making sure it captured anything Mr. Miller might try. "At least now, if he does something, we'll have proof," my father said, satisfied with the installation. The following days were a test of patience. Mr. Miller seemed to sense that we were trying to protect ourselves. When he passed by me or my father in the hallway, he threw malicious looks and made nasty jokes. "Have you fed your pet today?" he would say, laughing to himself. "Heard some strange noises again last night. Sure there's nothing hidden in there?" Every time he spoke, I felt a knot form in my stomach. My father tried to ignore him, but it was hard not to react. "Let's just ignore him, Laura. He's trying to provoke us," my father would say, trying to reassure me. But Mr. Miller didn't stop at jokes. He continued to accuse us of baseless things, especially of having an animal in the apartment. One afternoon, when I was coming back from school, I met him again in the hallway. This time, he blocked my way with a cynical smile. "You know, Laura, it's getting hard to ignore those noises. Maybe I should take a look around. Who knows what I'll find?" "We have nothing to hide, Mr. Miller," I replied, trying to stay calm. I was exhausted from these constant provocations and accusations. That night, I vented my frustration to my father. "We need to do something. We can't live like this, Dad." "We are doing something, Laura. The camera will help us. We need to be patient and gather evidence. That's the only way we can end this." I knew he was right, but the waiting and constant tension were wearing me down. Mr. Miller was determined to bother us, and we needed to be prepared for anything. Mr. Miller's provocations and accusations were wearing us down. Each day seemed worse than the last. After installing the security camera, we thought we would finally have some peace, but we were wrong. The recordings clearly showed Mr. Miller acting suspicious and aggressive, but even so, it didn't seem to be enough. We decided to seek help from the local authorities. One morning, after a particularly difficult weekend with Mr. Miller, we went to the neighborhood police station. "Good morning, officer. We need help with a problem we're having in our building," my father said to the attendant. The police officer, a robust man with a tired expression, listened patiently as we explained the constant provocations and accusations from Mr. Miller. We showed the security camera recordings, hoping they would be enough for something to be done. "I understand the situation, sir," said the officer after watching the recordings. "But unfortunately, without a threat or trespassing, we can't do much." "But he's constantly harassing us," I said, frustration evident in my voice. "Don't these recordings show enough?" "Unfortunately, no, miss. His behaviour is disturbing, but legally, we can't do anything based only on these images. If he trespasses or makes a threat, then we can act. Until then, I suggest you document everything and continue avoiding confrontations." We left the station feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. Even with evidence, it seemed we were alone in this fight. "This is ridiculous," I muttered as we walked back home. "He's going to keep doing whatever he wants, and no one can help us." "I know, Laura, but we won't give up," said my father, trying to stay calm. "We'll keep documenting everything. Eventually, he'll make a mistake, and when he does, we'll be ready." We returned to the apartment with an extra weight on our shoulders. We knew that for now, we would have to deal with Mr. Miller on our own. The security camera was still our best defense, but we also needed to find ways to protect ourselves emotionally. The atmosphere in our apartment was tenser than ever. Every noise, every knock on the door was a reason for us to be scared. Inevitably, Mr. Miller returned to torment us, this time even more aggressively. One cold night, loud, insistent knocks on the door startled us again. My father sighed and went to answer, while I, from the living room, could clearly see the tension on his face. "I'm sure you're hiding something in there," Mr. Miller shouted. "I know the noises and the smell is unmistakable." "Mr. Miller, we've told you many times we have nothing here. You must be hallucinating," my father replied, trying to stay calm. "Hallucinating? I'm hallucinating," Mr. Miller responded darkly. "I'm not an idiot. I know very well what's going on." The argument quickly escalated, with voices becoming louder and more aggressive. I decided to approach and support my father. When I reached the door, I saw that Mr. Miller was genuinely furious. "Get out of here now, before I call the police," my father said, trying to close the door. But at that moment, Mr. Miller, full of rage, shoved the door open, causing my father to lose his balance and fall to the floor. He stormed into the apartment, his eyes blazing with anger. "I know you're hiding something. I'm sure of it, and now I'm going to find out," he shouted, looking around. My father tried to get up, but Mr. Miller pushed him back and kicked him several times. I was horrified by what I saw. I screamed loudly, "Stop! Get out of here!" But he completely ignored me. At that moment, many things went through my mind. I thought about going to the kitchen to get a knife, or find anything to defend myself and my father. Then I heard a strange sound coming from inside the apartment. I looked to the side and saw something that made us all freeze. And what happened next was so fast it seemed like a blur. A huge animal emerged into the living room. I'm not sure if it was a very large dog or a wolf, but its expression of fury was unmistakable. It growled deeply, glaring at Mr. Miller. At this moment, he looked at the animal and said, "I knew it. Here's the animal," pointing to the wolf in the room. "You'll be evicted for breaking the building's rules." But the triumphant expression turned to terror when the wolf lunged. It pounced on Mr. Miller with a savage fury. My father and I quickly backed away, horrified by the scene unfolding before us. The wolf attacked Mr. Miller with relentless force. Claws and teeth tore into flesh and fabric, while Mr. Miller screamed and tried in vain to defend himself. The sound of growls and screams was deafening. Within minutes, Mr. Miller was motionless on the floor, his threats and provocations finally silenced. The wolf, covered in blood, turned to look at us. Its eyes met mine. I was very scared at that moment, just as my father, who approached to try to protect me. However, the animal looked at us, but its gaze was no longer furious. It simply turned and walked out the door, as if it knew exactly where to go. My father pulled me into a tight hug. We were alive, but the horrific scene we had just witnessed left us in shock. The shock of what had just happened still enveloped us like a dense cloud. My father and I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at Mr. Miller's lifeless body on the floor. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, and a mixture of fear and disbelief took over me. The silence in the hallway was surreal, considering the chaos that had just occurred inside our apartment. No other residents had appeared to see what was happening, despite the deafening noise. I could barely breathe, my thoughts swirling around what we had just witnessed. "Dad, what are we going to do?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately, still trying to process what had happened. Finally, he shook his head and went to the door. He opened it carefully, peeking into the hallway. The wolf that had saved us was no longer there. "It's gone," my father murmured, looking back at me with wide eyes. "This can't be happening," I said, my voice breaking. "What are we going to do? What if someone finds out?" "We need to think about the consequences," my father said, slowly closing the door. "What if we get arrested? What if no one believes what happened?" I knew he was right. The reality of what we had experienced seemed so absurd that it was hard to imagine explaining it to anyone. We were lost in our thoughts when a soft knock on the door startled us. My father cautiously opened it and found Mr. Thompson, our kind and reclusive neighbour. "I saw everything," he said in a low but firm voice. "I know it must be hard to process this, but I'm here to help." My father and I exchanged perplexed looks. How did he know what had happened? "Mr. Thompson, how—" I began, but he raised his hand to stop me. "There's no time for questions now. You need to leave here for a few days. I'll take care of everything," he said calmly. "But what if someone comes? What if—" My father started to protest, but Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No one will come. Trust me. Just leave the building and come back in 2 days. Everything will be taken care of." As strange as it seemed, no other residents in the building appeared to see what was happening. Mr. Thompson seemed to have a calm and inexplicable control over the situation. Desperate and with no other option, we did as he asked. We left the building that night, our minds still spinning with the horrific images and fear of the unknown. We spent 2 days in a cheap hotel, unable to sleep or think about anything else but what had happened. I couldn't get the image of the wolf out of my mind, the bright eyes and the violence with which it attacked Mr. Miller. No matter how much I tried to find a logical explanation, nothing made sense. "Dad, do you think we should have told the police?" I asked one night, lying on the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. "Laura, I don't know. What could we say? That a giant wolf appeared and saved us. They'd lock us up for insanity at the very least," he replied, rubbing his temples with his hands. "We need to trust Mr. Thompson, as strange as that seems." I knew he was right, but the uncertainty was unbearable. What would Mr. Thompson do with the body? How did he plan to resolve this? Each hour felt like an eternity, and my mind couldn't stop creating terrible scenarios. Finally, the day to return to the building arrived. My father and I were nervous as we walked down the hallway leading to our apartment. What would we find? What if the police were there? What if Mr. Thompson hadn't managed to clean everything? When we arrived, everything seemed normal. There were no signs of police activity or any disturbance. We entered the apartment, and to our surprise, everything was in order. There were no bloodstains, no body of Mr. Miller. It was as if the event had been erased from existence. "This is unbelievable," my father said, looking around in disbelief. "How did he do this?" I had no answers. The only thing I could think of was to check the security camera footage. I ran to the living room, connected the camera to the laptop, and started reviewing the recordings. As I re-watched the footage, I tried to pay close attention to every detail of the incident. When it got to the moment of Mr. Miller's invasion, a few minutes after he had broken into our apartment, I saw something that left me surprised and perplexed. The wolf that saved us emerged from Mr. Thompson's apartment and, after the event, returned there. Without delay, it was Mr. Thompson who came out and knocked on our door. That's when it hit me. He was the wolf. "Dad, come see this!" I shouted, my voice filled with astonishment and fear. My father came over and watched the footage in silence. The shock on his face mirrored my own. "Mr. Thompson, he's—" my father began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "A werewolf," I completed, still in shock. "And he saved us." We didn't know what to do with this revelation, but one thing was certain: our lives would never be the same. And now, more than ever, we knew we could trust Mr. Thompson. He had risked everything to protect us, and for that, we owed him our loyalty. Later that day, while we were still trying to process everything, we heard a knock on the door. My father opened it and found Mr. Thompson standing outside, his expression serene. "May I come in?" he asked calmly. "Of course, come in," my father replied, still shaken. We sat in the living room, the silence heavy between us. Finally, Mr. Thompson spoke. "I know you must have many questions, and I am here to answer them. But first, I want to assure you that you are safe. Mr. Miller will no longer be a threat." "How did you do it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How did no one hear anything? How did no one show up?" "I have my ways of handling such situations," he said enigmatically. "And as for the other residents, I took measures to ensure they were not disturbed." "And the body?" my father asked, hesitant. "I've taken care of that. You don't need to worry," Mr. Thompson replied. "Now, we need to discuss how to proceed from here." We spent hours talking with Mr. Thompson. He explained that he had been bitten by a werewolf decades ago, and since then, he lived reclusively to protect the people around him. His experience as a veterinarian helped him understand and control his condition. But he always feared the day his secret would be discovered. "I saw something in you two," he said, "a kindness and a strength that made me want to help. When I saw what Mr. Miller was doing, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. We don't know how to thank you," my father said, the emotion evident in his voice. "You don't need to thank me," Mr. Thompson responded. "Just know that I am here to protect you, just as you protect me by keeping my secret." As he spoke, I realized that our life in the building would never be the same. What had started as a nightmare had turned into a strange alliance with a supernatural creature.